those who are unable to attend are able to hear the talk and the discussion that follows. So just be aware that this is a recorded session. It's wonderful to see everybody here in the room and to see people gathering online. My name is Ben Mansky, and I am an assistant professor of public sociology here at Mason. Yes. As we're getting started. I wasn't gonna call you out, but I also direct Next System studies here at George Mason University. This is the first of just two Next System speakers that we've slated for the spring, so you're extra special. I just want to let everybody know that our second speaker is this coming Tuesday, and that is Dr. Tracy Corley, Northeastern University, giving a talk on transformative science for transitional times. And that will be taking place not here at our main campus in Fairfax, but at our second campus in Arlington at Mason Square. So just go to nextsystem.gmu.edu to find the information and join us in person. Lunch will be provided courtesy of Drew Peacock and the Arlington Fellows for those who are there in person, and otherwise you can join us online. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Johanna Bachmann, and she is going to make the introduction.
Hi, everybody. So it's really great to have Gabriel Hetland here. Is that the right word?
Yeah,
really good. Sorry. He's an associate professor of Latin American, Caribbean, Latina, and Latino studies, and is, of course, an awesome sociologist at the University of Albany. He uses ethnography and historical comparative methods to study the forces that enable and constrain the deepening and extension of democracy. So he's interested in things like left and right parties, social and labor movements, climate change, and national and urban politics in Latin America and in the United States. And today we're going to hear about his new book, which is Democracy on the Ground, Local Politics in Latin America's Left Turn. This book came out in last year, 2023, with Columbia University Press. And I also want to just briefly also say that he has two other projects that I think a lot of you will find very interesting. The first project is called Paths to Decarbonization, which is a cross-national comparative project that looks at Colombia, Spain, and New York State, thinking about the democratization of decarbonization, which I think is a very interesting idea. Bringing together decarbonization goes hand in hand with efforts to build more extensive and deeper forms of democracy. And his second project, The Specter of Venezuela, examines the pitfalls and promises of Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution. So welcome.
I have a microphone. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. So thank you so much, Joanna, for the introduction, and thanks, Ben, for facilitating and organizing the talk. Thank you all so much for showing up on a Friday. I can't imagine my students doing that at U Albany, so it's amazing to see so many of you and everyone who's here online as well. So I'll just launch right in. You can go to the next. We're going to do a little 80s style tech thing. So the Venezuelan cities of Torres and Sucre and the Bolivian cities of El Alto and Santa Cruz are among thousands of cities worldwide that have recently implemented democratic reforms seeking to give citizens greater control over decisions affecting their lives. Such reforms have been particularly widespread in Latin America, which has been at the forefront of what some call a participatory revolution. And when Latin America's participatory wave took off in the 1980s and 90s, it was led by innovative leftist parties like Brazil's Workers' Party, which instituted Porto Alegre's famed participatory budget. In the last 2 decades, non-left parties have implemented participatory experiments more frequently. Scholars have noted this, but there's been relatively little research on it. Can you guys still hear okay? Okay, good. I'm always nervous with microphones. So my book, Democracy on the Ground, and I have a few copies if anyone wants to buy one afterwards, takes up this task by comparing democratic deepening in cities governed by left and right parties in Venezuela and Bolivia at the height of Latin America's left turn or pink tide. This is a period when leftists were elected across the region, from Venezuela up to El Salvador. When I began my research, I had little doubt I would find greater success in the two left-run cities of Torres and El Alto. You can go to the next slide, and one more. There we go. With success meaning participatory reform giving citizens real control over local political decisions. And I'll talk more about what I mean by success over the talk. This expectation was based on the burgeoning urban participation literature, which shows that participatory reform is more likely to succeed in cities that are governed by a particular type of left party, a movement left party, or sometimes called a social movement party, a party that's closely linked to social movements, which I understand you guys were just talking about today in your class, and a party that's committed to participatory democracy. This was the case in both Torres and El Alto. Go to the next. And this shows Torres's movement left mayor, Julio Chavez, during one of many popular mobilizations he led during his time in office. And this shows El Alto's, you can go next, Mayor Edgar Patana in 2005 when he led El Alto's Regional Workers Central, or CORE, one of the city's many highly organized and mobilized social organizations. In 2010, Patana was elected the candidate of MAS, which, as you can see next, on this billboard next to El Alto's City Hall, promised to gobernar obedeciendo al pueblo, that is to rule by obeying. And you can go next. In the right-governed cities of Sucre and Santa Cruz, I didn't expect to find anything approaching participatory success. So I was thus genuinely surprised by the results of my research. You can go to the next, which were based on approximately 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork between 2007 and 2016. As you can see in this table, instead of finding success in the 2 left-governed cities, I found success in both the left and right-run cities in Venezuela, and failure in both the right and left-run cities in Bolivia. And my finding of greater success in Venezuela was also a surprise because it was governed by a left populist party as opposed to the movement left party running Bolivia. As noted, movement left parties have been seen as ideal for delivering participatory success. Left populist parties, by contrast, has been seen as particularly unlikely to do so. They've been seen as likely to talk about participation, but not actually make it happen. So the question that I grapple with in the book is what can explain these unexpected findings? And the answer I give is an interaction between national and local politics. I'm going to sit here. Yeah, I'll do it. So my argument centers on an unanticipated contrast in the type of national political regime found in Venezuela and Bolivia at the left turn's height. This contrast is rooted in the distinct way that each country's ruling party responded to the right-wing backlash that its rise to office elicited. Venezuela's ruling party responded with full-out populist mobilization, which in conjunction with the 2003 oil boom, facilitated the emergence of what I call a left populist hegemonic regime. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. Bolivia's ruling party responded to right-wing backlash with a mix of limited mobilization and significant demobilization of popular movements. And I won't really talk about why, but I can get into that in the Q&A if people are interested. From 2010 on, the MAS's demobilizing turn deepened, leading to a passive revolutionary regime. So this difference in national regime type was consequential for subnational politics, specifically for how left and right forces related to participation at the local level. Venezuela's left populist hegemonic regime transformed the rules of the game of politics such that all parties, even right-wing opposition parties, were forced to play the game of politics on the ruling party's left populist or Chavista terrain. Participatory democracy was a central part of this terrain, and accordingly, parties from across the political and ideological spectrum in Venezuela faced significant pressure to make a show of supporting popular participation. As I'll detail in the talk, this facilitated participatory success in electorally competitive cities where an opposition party of the left, or more surprisingly, the right, came to office. Bolivia's path to revolutionary regime differed from Venezuela's left populist hegemonic regime in 3 notable ways. First, while Venezuela's ruling, and you can go next, Venezuela's ruling party moved left under Chavez and compelled the right-wing opposition to move left as well, Bolivia's ruling party moved right from 2010 on. Second, while Venezuela's ruling party governed through populist mobilization, Bolivia's ruling party demobilized the popular movements from whence it came. And then third, while in Venezuela, participation was discursively and institutionally central, in Bolivia, it was mostly central just institutionally. As I'll discuss, this meant that Bolivian politicians from the opposition and the ruling party itself faced little pressure to govern in a participatory way. And this suggests that to the extent the Bolivian ruling party was a model for local parties, it was a model of demobilization. And I argue that these combined factors facilitated participatory failure in both the right and left-run Bolivian cases. So the next slide shows my overall argument that Venezuela's left populist hegemonic regime led to participatory success in the left and right cases, and Bolivia's passive revolutionary regime led to participatory failure in the left and right cases. You can go to the next. So to get at success and failure in my cases, I look at the following 4 indicators: the extent and quality of popular control over political decision-making, and institutional and political effectiveness. Go next. I measure the extent of popular control by looking at 3 things: the percent of the municipal budget that is subject to participatory budgeting, specifically the investment portion of the budget, turnout, and whether there's institutional mechanisms facilitating popular control over non-budgetary local decision-making. Next, I measure the quality of popular control by looking at how decisions are made in participatory institutions, specifically whether there's deliberation with reasons given to justify decisions, command and control decision-making, aggregated voting, or something else. Second, whether officials or participants have final say over decisions within these participatory processes. And then finally, the inclusivity of decision-making and local state resource practices of distribution in terms of class, race and ethnicity, gender, and political views. You can go next. Institutional effectiveness refers to the degree to which decision-making inputs are effectively translated into outputs. So I measure this using both objective indicators, such as the rate of budgetary execution, meaning what % of the budget is actually spent in a given year, and the rate of project implementation, meaning the % of approved projects that are implemented within a given time frame. And then I also look at subjective indicators, such as citizen perceptions of municipal executives' effectiveness and administrative performance. And I give particular weight to opposition views. So if an oppositionist thinks that a mayor they don't belong to, their party, is doing a good job, I weigh that as more significant than somebody who's from the same party. And then you can go next. And then finally, political effectiveness refers to the degree to which a city's political decision-making system generates popular consent. And I measure this by looking at whether the local incumbent party wins re-election, whether this occurs if they have a new mayoral candidate, the party's margin of victory or defeat, voter turnout, and whether the party has a cooperative or conflictual relationship to civil society. So now onto my case studies, the fun part of the talk, which is based on, you can go to the next, based on 22 months of this, yeah, perfect, of ethnographic fieldwork in the 4 cities conducted between 2007 and 2016. And I attended over 150 local government, civic associations, political party meetings, assemblies, workshops, protests, and other events. Conducted interviews with over 200 elected officials, bureaucrats, party and civic association leaders and members, and citizens. You can go next. So I'll begin with Torres, which from 2005 to 2016 may have been the world's most genuinely democratic city, understanding democracy as citizens' ability to affect decisions affecting their lives. Ordinary citizens during this time exercised a remarkable degree of control over political decisions. There was very extensive popular control over decisions. In 2005, Torres' mayor Julio Chavez established a participatory budget covering 100% of municipal investment. You can go next. The process started with participatory diagnoses, which you can see here. You can do another one. And then next. And then moved to assemblies where elected voceros or spokespeople discussed and voted on projects. You can go next and one more. And actually one more. Even one more. Sorry.
I can still do this if you want.
No, I can do it. Yeah, it's probably. Okay, got it. Perfect. Yeah, there we go. And this is the picture I really wanted to use for the book cover, but my editors were like, this is a terrible quality picture. Nobody will understand what's going on. Please don't use it. But I love this picture. Hopefully you do. This is people voting. So turnout in the participatory budget was massive. Somewhere between 8 and 25% of Torres' population of around 180,000 showed up every year. I was just about to get good data on this in 2016, and all the data crashed in the computer and was never recovered. So I had to sort of reconstruct it, but a lot of people showed up. And this reflects officials' commitment to fostering what they call autogobierno, or self-governance. Torres also had extensive popular control over non-budgetary decision-making. In 2005, Julio Chavez's first act as mayor was convening a municipal constituent assembly where residents rewrote Torres's ordinances. There are also assemblies where residents discuss and vote on issues such as bus fares. The quality of popular control was also very high in Torres. Decision-making was deliberative, with residents thoughtfully discussing the merits of different projects and offering reasons for supporting this versus that project. Voceros had final say, voceros being the spokespeople, And officials often tried to steer projects towards specific projects, but in dozens of assemblies that I attended, I never saw officials impose their views, and I often saw voceros, these spokespeople, choose projects that officials disliked. I remember going home with a bunch of officials in a truck, and they were like, damn it, why did they choose that? But it was good indicator that citizens actually had control. The process was quite inclusive. Both Chavistas and non-Chavistas participated in great numbers. Most, but not all participants were from the popular classes, and women outnumbered men. There was institutional effectiveness with upwards of 86% of projects implemented in a timely fashion, and residents directly implemented about 3/4 of the projects. Here's a picture of officials and residents inspecting a project in progress. And then finally, there was political effectiveness. The incumbent party in Torres was reelected multiple times, including importantly with a new mayoral candidate who was much less charismatic than Julio Chavez, suggesting to me that the participatory policies were really a big factor why he got reelected. Or elected and then reelected a couple times. Voceros also expressed a high degree of consent in the process. In one assembly, I asked a vocero, why not leave this to the mayor? I was often trying to be provocative in my field work, and he said this to me. Let me go here. In the past, government officials would stay all day in their air-conditioned offices and make decisions there. They never even set foot in our community. So who do you think can make a better decision about what we need? An official in his air-conditioned office who's never even come to our community, or someone from the community? So at first glance, there seems to be a simple explanation for Torres' success. They had a movement left mayor who was linked to highly mobilized popular movements. But my research shows that Torres' success came about in a more crooked fashion. Julio Chavez had to defeat the ruling party to win and hold office, but he repeatedly utilized the ruling party's rhetoric and institutional forms. Using the language of my book, I say that he refracted left populist hegemony into participatory democracy. You can see this in the way Julio spoke about popular power, a phrase that appears here on his campaign bus, participation, and socialism. When I asked him about his work as mayor, he responded, all expressions of socialism should be based on the people's participation, a participation that impedes bureaucratism. We say that the people should make all the decisions. We'd rather err with the people than be right without the people. I now turn to Sucre, which also had a non-Chavista mayor, Carlos Ocariz, who refracted Chavismo's left populist hegemony into participatory success. Like Julio Chavez, Ocariz spoke of, quote, doing popular power. You can see this here. He said, we don't just believe in popular power, we're doing popular power. And he used institutional forms associated with Chavismo, including participatory budgeting, which at this time was often identified as a Chavista process, although it's clearly not just a Chavista process. Ocariz devoted $35 million a year to participatory budgeting, with dozens of officials and thousands of residents attending around 1,000 participatory budget events per year. What makes this case quite surprising is that unlike Julio, and so here's a couple photos, unlike Julio Chavez, Ocariz was anti-Chavista and led a center-right party. I argue that Ocariz was compelled to implement participatory reform in a robust way by the combination of national left populist hegemony, which, as I noted, made participatory democracy central to politics throughout Venezuela, and the local context, specifically the fact that around 80% of Sucre's residents are from the popular classes. Here's a photo that shows the stark divide between Sucre's middle-class areas on the left and the barrios on the right. Interview data supports my view that national and local political context pushed Ocariz to implement participatory reform, with his own officials saying he did so due to the context and because of their awareness that participation was important to Chavista would-be voters in Sucre. Sucre's success was more modest than Torres for reasons that I discuss in the book, but won't have a lot of time to talk about now. But it was still quite impressive. There was moderately extensive popular control over decisions. After taking office in 2009, Ocariz implemented a participatory budget that initially covered 20 and later 40% of an investment budget over 100 million US dollars. And I asked officials in a sort of provocative way, I like to be provocative in the field, as you have heard. I asked if they'd be willing to go up to 100% as in Torres, but they said that would, quote, tie the mayor's hand and that, quote, people aren't ready. Turnout for Torres, or for Sucre's participatory budget was modest, but rose over time to around 25 participants a year by 2011. there was very limited popular control over non-budgetary issues. And all this reflects what I argue is a form of administered democracy in which officials were willing to give residents some, but not too much power. This can be seen in the modest quality of popular control. In assemblies, I found a mix of deliberation and command and control decision-making. Residents had near binding control over decisions, but officials weren't willing to give them full control. When I asked why not, one said, quote, the Venezuelan people lacked the maturity to have such control, unquote. The process was highly inclusive with men and women, popular and middle classes, and opposition and Chavistas participating extensively. Here's some pictures of Chavistas in proud red rojo gear coming out to a participatory budget assembly led by Carlos Ocariz. And Chavistas actually initially boycotted and sabotaged the process, throwing tomatoes at the mayor and, physically roughing up the process. But for various reasons, including seeing results, they started to participate extensively by 2011. This increased the quantity and quality of the process since Chavista participants were much better organized and more deliberative compared to oppositionists in their process of choosing projects. Chavista participants always had assemblies on their own to choose projects, while oppositionists rarely did. Some of the oppositionist activists would come up and be like, I want a security camera in my thing. And the officials would say, what? We can't do that. And the Chavistas always had a very thoughtful sort of conversation. Like Torres, there was institutional effectiveness with projects implemented in a timely way. Over 70% were implemented by citizens themselves. And importantly, Chavistas opposed to Ocariz regularly praised his work, although they weren't going to vote for it. The process was also politically effective. The incumbent party was re-elected, though unlike Torres, with the same rather than a new mayoral candidate. And as you can see here, the incumbent party's vote share increased in Ocariz's first 2 years of office, including in 3 parishes that overwhelmingly supported Chavismo. So actually, contradicting what I just said, some of the Chavistas did end up voting for Ocariz over the time. And the impressive degree of Sucre's success can really be appreciated when it's compared to my right and left Bolivian cases. I'll turn first to the right-wing case of Santa Cruz. Like Sucre, I expected a lack of participatory success since Santa Cruz had a right-wing mayor and a comparatively weakly organized civil society. Unlike Sucre, this expectation of failure was more than met. There was almost no popular control over political decision-making. When I started my research, I was told of a participatory process called neighbor demand. I spent weeks trying to find someone knowledgeable about this. I finally did, and I was told that it hadn't happened in years and had been, quote, a disaster, and, quote, participation works best when it's imposed by the executive, unquote. I didn't even know what that meant exactly. Other officials showed disdain for participation. One explained that in the last neighbor demand he'd attended 4 years earlier, quote, residents' priorities were health, education, paving, and drainage in that order, unquote. But he told me that the funding was the absolute reverse of this, with the most spent on paving and drainage and the least on health and education. To this official, this showed that, quote, there's a difference between what residents say they want and what they actually need, unquote. I thought there was a difference too, but not that one. While I didn't find any real participation in Santa Cruz, I did find instances of pseudo participation showing extremely limited, extremely low quality of popular control. I'm just going to make sure I don't lose the batteries on this. And one case of this was a modestly participatory budget discussion I attended in District 9, one of Santa Cruz's poorest districts. And I'm proud and ashamed of having attended this assembly because I was invited to a Shakira concert, already paid for that same night, and I didn't go. I went to the assembly instead. So that's a commitment to fieldwork that I should have published. And I went partly because there was very, very few participatory spaces. So I was like, I have to go, but always kind of regret it. So anyway, this assembly of around 40 participants had a robust discussion and agreed to fund 2 sports fields. But the official who was facilitating this arbitrarily rejected that and forced the discussion to continue until the assembly approved the outcome that she wanted, which was to fund 3 fields. The process was extremely exclusionary, with masistas blocked from participating and blocked from even attending. And this category of the masista was used in an openly racist way to refer to not just supporters of the ruling MAS, but to nearly any darker-skinned indigenous or indigenous-looking resident, according to the person speaking, who didn't support Santa Cruz's right-wing mayor, Percy Fernandez. Santa Cruz appeared to have institutional effectiveness, as you can see from this graph showing It's budgetary execution. Again, that's the percent of the budget that's actually spent in a given year. In Santa Cruz, this was consistently higher than the average of Bolivia's large cities. But when I talked to residents, I found that something like 60% of projects in some districts were phantoms that appeared to be finished on paper, but were actually incomplete. I also found widespread and credible allegations of corruption and fraud, not only in projects, but in representation of neighborhood assemblies, which were regularly and illegally taken away from legitimately elected macistas and given to supporters of the mayor. So some people told me that they had gone for what they thought was a vaccination. Yes.
What's macista?
Masista means a supporter of the MAS, but it's a category that was used much more broadly than that. So the MAS is the ruling party in Bolivia, the Movement to Socialism Party, the party of Evo Morales. So that's what a Masista is. And so there was this political split between the opposition and the Masistas there. And Masistas, so supporters of Evo Morales, would get control over neighborhood assemblies, but then they would be arbitrarily taken away. And some of the evidence I saw of the sort of corruption was, they would go get gas from a gas station and they would add an extra one to it. There was a vaccination campaign one time that people showed up and they signed in for the vaccination, but it turned out they were actually signing in to vote for a non-Masista to take over a neighborhood assembly. And I was at another meeting in District 9 where the person in charge of it was showing photographs of completed projects, and there was mostly women in the audience who said, wait, you said that's in my neighborhood? And she'd come over and she said, that doesn't exist. And then another participant said, that doesn't exist. And another participant, and then the facilitator was like, oh yeah, the picture's from pretty far away. Who knows what it is? And he kind of backed away. So there's just a lot of evidence of people not being happy with what was going on. So this brings me to Santa Cruz's semi-effectiveness in a political sense. And I use this term since the evidence is mixed on this point. On the one hand, the mayor was reelected multiple times, but it came with a decreasing vote share. And there was also a significant dissent to his rule, which took the form of regular protests seeking inclusion in decision-making and resource distribution. The local MAS, again, the party of Evo Morales, initially supported this, leading to some success in marginal districts. But as the party's passive revolutionary and demobilizing turn took hold at the national level around 2010, its local strategy changed from confronting to collaborating with the mayor. In 2008, this mayor had called for the army to overthrow Evo Morales, but in 2013, as you can see here, Evo's in the middle there, and then it's the right-wing prefect of Santa Cruz, Ruben Costas on the left, and then the Percy Fernandez on the right. In 2013, Evo was regularly lunching with and happily posing for pictures with the mayor and Santa Cruz's right-wing governor. This left marginalized communities in Santa Cruz even more marginalized. And so I now turn to my final case, El Alto, which I had high expectations for, as it was governed by the MAS, a seemingly movement left party, and had a well-earned reputation as a rebel city, since its residents had led Bolivia's famous 2003 and 2005 gas wars. And those are basically periods where there was huge popular protest over a national policy to export Bolivia's natural gas to Chile and then to the United States. Bolivians were furious about this, and out of that protest, around 74 people were killed. The president had to resign. It happened again in 2005. The president was again forced to resign, and it led to Evo Morales' election. So El Alto was the center of this, and a place where massive mobilization takes place. So I was quite surprised by how similar El Alto was to Santa Cruz in being a case of participatory failure. So let me go through the key indicators a little bit quickly. There was a modest degree and quality of popular control over decisions, with a participatory budget-like process that covered around 25% of the municipal budget. Turnout for this was robust, and the process was deliberative and inclusive. So far, so good. The problem was that the process was not tied to output. As you can see in this graph, here's a couple, I'll show you a few pictures of, this is a civic march in El Alto where from 6 a.m. in the morning until 6 p.m., you just see group after group after group marching. So El Alto is a very, very, very highly organized city. Here's a statue of Che Guevara in one of the plazas. The poster saying ruling by obeying. All right, here's the graph I wanted to get to. As you can see in this graph, and this is showing the process, how the participatory budget and the budget in general is not tied to output. El Alto had a dismal record of budgetary execution, regularly performing well below the large city average. And this led the Vice President Alvaro Garcia Linero to call out El Alto several times publicly and say, this is shameful, you got to do better. My research suggests that widespread corruption was a key reason for this, with this corruption occurring in major and minor ways. Sometimes just stolen cement bags, and then 33 trucks that disappeared and got some people in trouble, as I'll talk about in a second. Another claim was that there was bureaucratic incoherence, ironically due to the strength of civil society and social organizations, which often control municipal officials who they placed in office and who remained loyal to the organization rather than to the mayor. And so there wasn't an ability to actually get everybody to work on the same policies. The lack of output predictably led to problems for El Alto's movement left mayor, who failed to win re-election in 2015. After leaving office, he was arrested, and there's a couple pictures I won't go over, but after elected, he was arrested and convicted of corruption for the theft of 33 municipal vehicles, and he spent the next 4 years in jail. And I argue that a key reason for participatory failure in both Santa Cruz and El Alto is the ruling party's passive revolutionary trajectory, which manifested in the local mosque in both instances, prioritizing demobilization, narrow party interests rather than a broader participatory project. All right, so I'm just about done, and I'll get to the key takeaways of the talk. The first one is the need to place local participation in the national context. So the cases that I have on paper look very similar. So on the one hand, you have El Alto, a movement left mayor, highly organized civil society, and Torres, movement left mayor, highly organized civil society. Torres was very successful. El Alto was totally failure. If you just look at local factors, it's hard to make sense of that. If you bring in the national context, it illuminates it in a very useful way. Similarly, Sucre and Santa Cruz, they both had right-wing or center-right mayors, comparatively weaker civil societies in the context of a ruling left party, a large urban base that continued to support that ruling left party, and yet Sucre went one particular way, Santa Cruz went another way. The argument that I put in the book is that if you don't pay attention to national context, it's harder to explain the striking difference between two cases that look fairly similar on paper. The second conclusion of the book is that real democracy, quote unquote, real democracy, where ordinary citizens actually have control over decisions affecting their lives, is more possible than many people think. Under some circumstances, specifically leftist hegemony, the right can be forced to change its mind. So let me talk for a second about the broader literature. This is one of the big points of the book, so I'll spend a couple minutes on this. There's a sense in political science in particular, but also political sociology, that democracy has to be safe. If it gets too threatening, elites will end it. And one of the classic cases for proving this point is Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende tries to establish a very real form of democracy from the point of view of the left, democratic socialism. Of course, that leads to Pinochet. There's many other examples in Latin America and around the world where democracy becomes threatening. The right says, hell no, we're not going to accept any form of democracy. Democracy is over. So the argument I make in the book is that if you have leftist hegemony, you can actually establish a more real form of democracy and bring the right with you. And I argue that this means we can think of Hugo Chavez as the Margaret Thatcher of the left. So I'll take a couple minutes to explain what I mean by this. So Margaret Thatcher was famously asked in 2000 or 2002, well, how much time is left? I got like, okay, great. All right, I'll be done in like 2 minutes or so. So Margaret Thatcher was famously asked in 2000 or 2002 what her greatest accomplishment was. Does anyone know what she answered? Go ahead.
New Labor.
Yes, she specifically said Tony Blair and New Labor. And the reason she said that was Tony Blair was the head of the Labor Party. So Margaret Thatcher was the head of the Conservative Party, and yet she pointed to Tony Blair because she then said we forced our opponents to change their minds. And so she took credit, as well she should, for the transformation of the Labor Party under Tony Blair, which went from a party that in the 1980s officially espoused socialism, was a leftist party, to under Tony Blair in the 1990s, embracing free market capitalism, completely disavowing socialism, and taking a very, very hard right turn. So the argument I have is that Hugo Chavez can similarly be thought of as forcing his opponents to change their minds. So here's a picture of Hugo Chavez on the left, and then on the right is Enrique Capriles, who's from the same party as Carlos Ocariz, the mayor of Municipio Sucre that I was talking about and that I researched in the book. Enrique Capriles was Chavez's opponent in 2012. Greg Grandin, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author and well-known scholar of Latin America, said in 2012 that Capriles was running as a Chavista. Capriles' platform was to increase spending on education, increase spending on healthcare, do Chavista type policies. So this is the argument that Hugo Chavez is the Margaret Thatcher of the left because he forced his opponents to change his mind. And to give you a sense of what this means and what this might mean in a context like the US, imagine Bernie Sanders if he had won the 2020 primary and then won the 2020 election, and then Marco Rubio starts to sound like Bernie Sanders. Marco Rubio says, you know what? We should embrace Cuba. You know what? We should spend more on healthcare and education. We should embrace immigrants. We should, unbelievable to sort of think, but that's what happened in Venezuela at the time. There's a more complicated history of what happened after, and I'm not going to get into that, but I can get into it in the Q&A. Short story, it didn't last very long. It was built on poor foundations, but it was there for a while, and it was really interesting and impressive. All right, and then the final conclusion of the book is that the need to rethink Venezuela and Bolivia as cases of the left turn and rethink left populist and movement left parties. So Venezuela is thought of as this more top-down case where participation is not going to be particularly likely. Bolivia is thought of as a much more bottom-up case of movement left party. What I show is that the dynamics of the two national regimes early on, the way in which they're responding to the right-wing backlash, led them to different trajectories over time, and those different trajectories unfolded possibilities for participation in very different ways. So there was a lot of facilitation and possibility for real, genuine participation in Venezuela, and surprisingly not in Bolivia. All right, that's it. Thank you so much. Sure, I can do my own questions unless you have a way you wanna. Somebody has a.
Yeah, I don't know if we're in the Q&A yet.
I think so. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything
I have
else.
initiated the Q&A. Okay, so I was gonna ask, because Venezuela changed. You said Venezuela was going left, but I mean, I've heard Maduro described as like having the charisma of Mitt Romney, which is funny. But point is, I think things changed. I mean, and it's very hard for me to tell what exactly is American propaganda and what is like something went wrong. Obviously, something did go wrong, but it's very hard to tell exactly what, from my perspective, other than I don't know. They built it off of oil, of course. But yeah, what's your take?
Yeah, so the argument about Venezuela going left is going left under Chavez. And certainly after Chavez died in 2013, Maduro was elected. I'm not a fan of Maduro. I've written publicly about it. I've gotten lots of hate mail, including from a 78-year-old white Galveston, Texas Madurista who told me where I could shove it for criticizing Maduro publicly. So I have a track record of not liking Maduro, and I agree with your criticism of him. But he was dealt a tough hand, and so under Maduro, there was a crisis that emerged, and the reasons for that are complicated, but have to do with initially on sort of very technical, but currency policy in Venezuela. Currency policy was established in response to U.S. sort of an imperialist meddling in 2002, 2003. They supported a coup against Chavez, and then there was a major threat of capital flight. So Chavez implemented currency controls. So currency controls made a lot of sense in 2003 up until 2005. Then they didn't make a lot of sense, but Chavez kept them in place. By 2012, 2013, 2014, around the time Maduro's getting into office, which is in April 2013, the currency controls were facilitating massive corruption within Venezuela to the tune of hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars overall. And so that's one of the problems. And Maduro kept them in place until 2019, 2020. So that's one factor, a very specific one. Oil is another one. Chavez got in office in 1998. Venezuela's foreign sort of earnings, I think it was like 67% came from oil. After Chavez left office, it was up to like 96%. So oil dependency increased significantly under Chavez. And that was a major problem in 2014 when the price of oil declined. And then US sanctions. So since at least 2015, before Trump, Obama declared that Venezuela was an extraordinary national security threat, which the opposition laughed about and said, we are not a threat to anyone at the time. And then they kind of backed it off. And that implemented sanctions on some officials in Venezuela, which were over complied with by businesses around the world. And then under Trump, the sanctions really took hold in 2017 and then even more in 2019. So Venezuela had a horrific crisis. Almost 8 million Venezuelans have left. They're all over the United States now. I live in New York City and I see Venezuelans all over the place. They're probably around this area as well, I would imagine. It's just a tragic situation. US sanctions right now and for a number of years have been the main factor, but they're not the only factor. And Maduro indeed has responded with sort of a neoliberal policies, a right-wing turn, an incredibly repressive turn. He has a difficult situation. He's never had an easy sort of path, but he's responded with authoritarian, autocratic, repressive, neoliberal policies. And yet there's still some support on grassroots popular movements for him because they like him better than opposition leaders. So it's a complicated situation in Venezuela, but it's not a good one. So I would say the book is really focused on the Chavez period. I talked a little bit about some of this other stuff. And under Chavez, there was a trajectory to the left. So that's how I would square what I'm talking about with what I'm answering here.
And is anybody here willing to act like Phil Donahue, go around? And so I need to stay at that.
I can do that. If
You
you
can do
want.
that?
Yeah,
That's
I'm
great.
happy to. Oh. Question? All right.
Courage.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, how do you enforce stronger stability, I guess, within the hegemonic system that would allow greater participatory democracy or control? Because if you have from what it seems like, they had a hegemonic change, then they established more participatory systems, and then it slowly kind of not even really slowly, but it kind of just switched off over the next few years immediately after Chavez left, which then begs the question of, do you reinforce the hegemony when you have it before immediately implementing the participatory controls? Or is there something they could have done better, I guess?
Yeah, great question. So I would say that, Venezuela, the left populist hegemony that I've been talking about had a political foundation built on Chavez's charisma. That was not sustainable because people died. And that was going to happen at some point, or they leave office because their term limits and things like that. They did get rid of them, and controversially under Chavez in a criticized move. So that's one problem. If they had actually figured out the transition issue, figured out how to have somebody other than Chavez take over and really thought about it, attempts were made to think about that even when Chavez was alive, but he quashed it. He was not a big fan of that. The economic foundations of left populism, oil booms, are not a smart thing to base it on. It's incredibly difficult to break with oil dependency. I don't actually know of any successful. I know some places that were developed before they got oil, like Norway, but the literature on oil in particular and sort of diversifying the economy, countries talk about that. All the oil economies talk about it. They try to do it during the middle of an oil boom, and none of them have really succeeded. So figuring out how to do that is essential. Diversification of the economy, industrialization beyond oil, things like that would have to happen. This left populist model, I find it fascinating, interesting, and I found it surprisingly conducive to participation. But the way populism, or specifically left populism, has worked in Latin America is through this sort of double process where there's a mobilization from above of popular movement and control at the same time. So there's this combination of like mobilizing and controlling. You can see this with Cárdenas in Mexico. You can see it with Perón, and the particular combination of mobilizing and control differs in particular cases. In Venezuela, there's a lot of bottom-up organizing, but also a lot of attempts to sort of control it. I think moving from a left populist model to more of a democratic socialist model would be what you'd have to do. The one case I have that gives me some hope is Torres. So the Torres case, the left case in Venezuela, did move more towards what I would call democratic socialism at the local level. And one way they did that was having these strong links between a leftist in office who was tightly linked to social movements. And that was partly because of the opposition he faced from the ruling party, which he was politically supportive of and then joined actually in 2006. But he was never comfortable within it. He always was getting down. And so that meant he had to continuously mobilize his bases. and renew his links to the bottom, renew his links to sort of popular movements. That allowed him to withstand and allowed the process to withstand a lot of pressure from above. So something like that, I think, would have to be transformed at the national level. I'm not quite sure how you would do that, but that's what you'd have to do. Yeah, great question.
So regarding the example of Bolivia, and specifically the lack of mobilization against the right, what kind of just caused that? Was it a lack of attention? Was it getting too comfortable in a seat of power? Was it just
Great question. So I'd say the key factor there was at the time that there was this right-wing backlash, Bolivia was coming out of a 5-year cycle of protest, a revolutionary crisis, a revolutionary upsurge, massive social mobilization. So ironically, the problem, in a sense, was that social movements were already mobilized. They were already really strong. They already supported Evo Morales. So the right was sort of reacting against Evo Morales after he got into office. He couldn't land his plane in over half the country, 5 of the 9 departments of the country he couldn't go to. And there was, weird international agency that said there's a 56% chance of civil war in Bolivia. I don't know how they come up with figures like that, but there was a real, major crisis. Morales could count on a highly organized, mobilized base when he needed it. And he was worried that if he, and expressed this at times, if he mobilized the base further, it could move to more civil war. So there was a sense that why would we do this? There's always a risk and a benefit if you're going to mobilize. If you're sort of a political elite thinking about mobilizing a popular base, there's a risk that you're going to piss off other elites, you're going to piss off the right. Especially, he didn't need to do any more mobilizing because he could already count on it. So he did selective mobilization in his early years in office, but also demobilization. Once the threat of the right was gone, he did more and more demobilization. So it's from 2010 onwards. There's a famous Tipnis conflict in a national park in the lowlands of Bolivia where he wanted a road to go through in terms of getting resources to his base and for development and things like that. There was a lot of mobilization against that. The state repressed it. So it was the strength of civil society in this particular conjuncture that actually, which is weird. It's not exactly what you'd expect, but that's how it played out. Yeah, let me go here and then back there.
Thank you. So you've given us these 2 case studies of Venezuelan cities that, have built systems of participatory democracy in the context of a larger left hegemony.
Mhm.
Now, I understand that your argument, explicitly ends, in 2013. But do we have any data on these cities' ability to maintain their, political climate in the context of a shifting national climate, or is that like a direction for future research?
Yeah, and I misspoke a little bit. My argument goes roughly up to 2016. That's the last time I did fieldwork, and I kind of do a little bit beyond that. And that's important because actually the 2 cases are different. So Torres being the left case in Venezuela continued, and it continued to have a fairly robust participatory democracy through at least 2016. And I wasn't there after that, but I'm pretty confident that it lasted for a couple of years. The right was brought back into power through an election in 2021, I think. But they got reelected many, many times, and they stayed in office for a number of years during a massive crisis. They kept participation going. Even 2016, the crisis was already there, and they were still doing participatory budgeting, still doing it in an inclusive way. There was fraying of it. There was less sort of pluralism compared to what I had seen before. There was less money. There was more problems, but it was still going. So they were able to sustain it. Sucre, it fell apart, and it fell apart after 2013. It took a couple of years, so it wasn't right away, but it really diminished because the left populist hegemony that had been one of the main sort of things that had pushed it, meaning the success of Chavismo, crumbled. Chavez died, the price of oil tanks, and so by 2015 I was there, and then again in 2016, in Sucre, they were not doing the participatory budget at all. They were doing a much, much reduced form of participation. And this is overdetermined, the sort of transition away from it, because you can't even budget when you're in times of hyperinflation. So forget about participatory budgeting. When the prices are going up 700%, you need to spend the money now, which means you need to do really small projects that can be done in a couple of months as opposed to a couple of years. So there's a lot of factors, but the main one that I point to is that left populist hegemony crumbled and that went away. That's unfortunate, tragic, horrible thing. It helps the argument of my book because it shows that with the left populist hegemony, you get this interesting behavior by the right. When that goes away, it doesn't last. And so it also, suggests that the left populist hegemony was built on these somewhat weak foundations because it couldn't withstand certain crises. Let me go over here to a new question and then over back there. Yeah, go ahead.
So you talked a little bit about, you mentioned gender, and I wanted to know more about the role of women in the participation, mobilization in both countries. How does the treatment of women in those countries impact their involvement in participation and mobilization?
Great question. So Venezuela, the base of communal councils and the base of Chavismo was women. Women were doing tremendous organizing. If you went to the meetings, it'd be upwards of 70% of women in a lot of those spaces. They were in a lot of leadership positions. They were doing a lot of grassroots at the higher levels within politics, not as much, but decent. I mean, Venezuela had a pretty decent representation of women throughout the sort of political system. And I think it did improve under Chavez, although I have to actually look at specific data. There's some books written about it that suggest, certain specific programs for like wages for housework didn't really work and things like that. But women were a major part of Chavez's base and were really sort of incorporated in the grassroots organizing that I was looking at. Bolivia is more complicated, and El Alto, for instance, had many more men in the leadership of organizations. So one of the community organizations in El Alto that I look at, the most important one in El Alto is called PEJUVE. When I was there, they had the first ever president being a woman. This woman named Fanny Nina, who was elected in this raucous assembly of 2,000 people. I'm not quite sure how they decided she got more votes than somebody else. It was all just by acclamation and raising hands and things like that. But anyway, she was declared the winner. She only lasted 3.5 months in her position. By the next time I was there in October, she was already under threat and she was out of office as president a couple months later. Specific misogyny was used against her. There was physical violence against her at one point. She was in the hospital for what turned out to be menstrual cramping, which was publicized illegally and horrifyingly, and that was used against her and saying she's not strong enough to be a leader, she can't be doing these things. And that was after she faced some physical aggression. It was also overdetermined in the sense that she had been getting a little closer to some of the opposition parties. She'd been confronting Evo Morales in a sort of public manner, and so that elicited a lot of backlash from the MAS, the ruling party within Bolivia. So there was a bunch of different factors, but misogyny was absolutely one of them. Santa Cruz was a little better. I mean, the very non-participatory space, but women were there. They were showing up. They were racistly excluding the masistas as well. And so it's more complicated than just saying El Alto had a lack of women's participation, because there's some ideologies that sort of proclaim that men and women in a, husband-wife coupling, which is a pairing, have a sort of support each other in particular ways. There's a systems within indigenous cultures that sort of are elaborated to justify particular things, but in practice, it seemed like a lot of misogyny and a lot of patriarchal control was still happening. And I don't know the anthropology research that would show, are these things just justification of continuing male control, or is there actually something to this idea of men and women doing different things but actually complementing each other? So that's how I thought in the cases. All right, yeah.
Yeah, so you have these terms of left populism and movement left. So does your definition of populism generally revolve around like mobilizing popular support behind one person specifically, as opposed to movement left, which is like more broad? Or
Yeah, great question. So I would understand populism as somewhat an anti-outside sort of someone mobilizing an outsider discourse, so an anti-elite outsider discourse, mobilizing popular and middle classes against an elite, often an amorphously defined elite, and then you can add other stuff to that. So it's a kind of loose definition. Populism can take many, many different forms. The left populism that I'm looking at within Latin America has often espoused participatory democracy. It doesn't have a great track record of actually getting there, but it's espoused the sort of idea of popular power. There's often a critique of representative. Thank you guys so much for coming. there's a critique of representative democracy as not being a genuine form of democracy, which you can see in many cases, there's some truth to that, but it can be used to just erode democracy entirely. Charismatic leaders are often part of populist experiments. I don't think they're necessarily have to be central to all populist experiments. I mean, there's literatures that tries to do subtypes of populism, and there's relatively more organized, but I would say generally a key difference between a movement left party and a populist party is that a populist party is much more top-down oriented, does have often connections to charismatic leaders, and has much more inhibiting civic autonomy, whereas movement left parties tend to sort of promote autonomy of civil society, autonomy of social movements, meaning that if social movements are involved, the party explicitly, like the Workers' Party in Brazil, explicitly tries not to dominate those spaces and declares spaces to be free of party politics. And I found that in Torres, they were pretty good at doing that. But in a lot of Chavista spaces, it was much more amorphous. So it's not a clear answer to your question, but it's partly because populism itself is a very enormous concept that can sort of do many different things. I would suggest my own approach to populism is just define what you mean by it, be clear about that, delimit it, and then use it in a consistent way. I don't think it's possible to get a definition of populism that everyone's going to agree on because there's just so many. But I think if you define it, you can still use it in productive ways. But it's often abused, and it's a tricky concept to really go to town with.
Quick follow-up, what was the name of Julio Chavez's original party?
It was Patria para Todos, so Fatherland for All, and that was a party that actually came out of a movement left party in the 1990s called La Causa R or La Causa Radical, which was a sort of social, it was kind of like the Workers' Party in Venezuela. They almost won the presidency in 1992. There's some dispute, they maybe did win it, and there was a stolen election, not entirely clear. They then sort of split, and one of the more participatory democratic faction formed this group called Patria para Todos in the late 1990s. That was the party that Julio Chavez ran on in both 2000 when he got trounced, and then 2004 when he won a three-way election, which was split between the official Chavista candidate, the opposition, and him. He squeaked by with just a little bit. He then joined the PSUV, the ruling United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which Hugo Chavez created, I think, in 2006. Julio Chavez joined the party, was part of it, part of efforts to create a radical current within the party. So he was always to the left of the party. He was trying to create participatory spaces. More recently, I find his trajectory depressing, where he's kind of a government lackey and a spokesperson, and he's on the media. I don't know if he genuinely believes it, but he's fully embedded with Maduro. He's even embedded with people he criticized before. So his trajectory has made him rise, but for a long time, he was this fiery sort of outside figure. And he's not related to Hugo Chavez, just as an aside. They share the same last name, but lots of Chavezes in Venezuela. Okay.
I think that's really interesting and really helpful ways of phrasing and organizing that. And I was just wondering, with the picture you showed of the rule by obeying, is that something to do with Morales, or is that to do with the opposition or the person shaking the Morales? I think
so. This was a campaign that emerged in, I think it was in 2010, and it emerged kind of at a strategic moment. It was a national campaign in Bolivia, so you saw these billboards all across the country, and it was actually after something called the gasolinazo. So this was a crisis that Morales faced in December and January 2010. I can't remember if it was maybe 2010 or 2011. I'm sort of thinking of when the posters came out. But so these were in El Alto, they were in La Paz, they were in Santa Cruz, and the gasolinazo was, they attempted to raise the price of gasoline. There was huge popular protests. They had to renounce it, but his popularity took a hit. And then they had this advertising campaign, which the MAS sort of went along with at a rhetorical level, but it really didn't translate into anything at the local level.
Okay. And the other question I had was, like in Torres and Sucre, did you notice that there were different kinds of projects that were decided on through participatory budgeting? And did the people that in like, let's say Torres, the projects were more supported by people in a way that gave them an investment in those projects, as opposed to Sucre, where there were fewer projects or maybe different kinds of projects because of the face of the city?
Can I just tag one of the things? A number of people here know what participatory budgeting is. And
Okay.
Maybe some who don't.
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So Participatory budgeting is basically a process where ordinary citizens are given control through a sort of decentralized system of decision-making over the local budget. So instead of the mayor and city council having all the control, you'll have assemblies of citizens coming together. Usually there's smaller assemblies and communities that elect representatives who are called delegates. Venezuela had a big debate about whether they should be, I mean, people were like, they're not representatives, they're voceros, which is spokespeople. So the idea was that they shouldn't be representing, they should just be voicing. That's very complicated because it's very hard to voice many different people. So they were representatives in a way, but they didn't accept that. So they're interesting debates. But in terms of Torres and Sucre, a lot of the projects were somewhat, they were somewhat similar in some senses in that they addressed basic needs. So sewers and drainage pipes, cultural centers, things like that. Torres is a much more rural municipality. So a lot of the projects were like road paving, basic infrastructure things. So that was kind of similar. Torres was really advanced in terms of moving towards communes. And so this is something I don't really talk about a lot in the book, but communes are when you get communal councils, which are groups of like 20 to 40 families in rural areas or 200 to 400 families in urban areas coming together. Those are in a communal council, like a neighborhood association sort of. And then you'd have 7 or 8 or up to 13 of them coming together to form a commune, and you could do larger projects. So in Torres, there was a move towards these more socioeconomic, socio-productive projects. That was kind of outside the participatory budget process. And there was a way in which there's a lot of money coming to Venezuela through oil and through funding. And in Torres, a lot of it went to cool stuff. Not all of it went through the participatory budget. And so I sort of delimited what I was looking at to some extent through that. Although some of it did, and there'd be some parts of it through this. And I mean, it'd be sort of complicated to work it all out. But yes, in Torres, I'd say that there was a really advancement towards, production and thinking about that. There was some movement towards what I would think of as socialism in the sense that there was some national productive processes. There was a socialist electric meter factory that was set up by the national government, but the local communal councils really tried to take hold of that. And that led to a years-long dispute with the Ministry of Electricity in Caracas, where they were trying to control it through the state, and the local communal councils were saying, no, we should have control over the profits. We should decide all of these factors. We should decide. That's what socialism is, us deciding, not you deciding. And they made some progress, but it wasn't totally clear. So that would be one thing. The other thing, I guess, in terms of how people talked about it, there was a lot of discourse of socialism, especially in Torres. I mean, people would identify as socialists, and they would identify projects as socialists. They would say participatory budgeting is socialism. And so socialism was kind of a Laclauian empty signifier that got filled with different content, but ideas about participatory democracy, equality, solidarity were often used, but there are people saying, you're not a socialist if you do this, you're not a socialist. So it was always a sort of open discursive field. So that's how I'd sort of answer it. It's a great question.
This is probably a pretty simple question, but can you just say why El Alto is called the Rebel City?
Yeah, sure. So this was a phrase that it appeared on books, and it sort of emerged in the mid 2000s after El Alto had been the epicenter of these major mobilizations in 2003 and then 2005. So Bolivia in in the 1990s went through a process of neoliberalism, and social movements were sort of relatively weak. And then there was something called the water war in Cochabamba, which reversed the privatization of water in the city of Cochabamba. And that kicked off a 5-year period of protests throughout the country. The high point of that was October 2003 in El Alto, where there was a movement by the president, a neoliberal president, explicitly González Sánchez de Lozada Goni is his nickname, educated in the US. I think he for a while lived in Fairfax. Actually, he might have been living here or somewhere in Virginia. And I think he got extradited somewhat recently because he's been held responsible for what happened. So he had a gringo accent. He didn't speak Spanish that well. He had been educated in the US, got elected president. He'd been a sort of minister. I don't know if it was a finance or production or something, or like the economy in the 1990s, and got elected in the mid 1990s, and then re-elected in 2002. Evo Morales almost won, but didn't quite win. Anyway, so he was privatizing a lot of things, and he wanted to sort of privatize and move natural gas. I'm not sure if they were all part of the same exact thing, but the idea was to sell natural gas to Chile and the United States in 2003, but in a way that protesters felt did not benefit Bolivia. They wanted to industrialize natural gas. They didn't want it to just go to Chile. There's also some nationalism with Chile having a border dispute with Bolivia going back like 100 years. So lots of different factors, but mobilization happened in El Alto over a course of 2 weeks. 74 people were killed in massive government repression. The repression led middle classes who'd been on the fence or not supportive to come out in huge numbers. El Alto encircled, it's a large city, mostly indigenous, above La Paz, which is sort of a ring of mountains, plateau in the Andes, and then La Paz is in this bowl underneath. Basically circled it, blockaded it, cut it off, which mirrored some indigenous sort of circling of the city from the 1780s and an earlier anti-colonial uprising. And so there's these, racist specters of the past and things like that, and also, pride and various things. And so that led Goni to resign. González de la Sala resigned in October 2003. And then again, his replacement, Carlos Mesa, who had been his vice president, who actually resigned before Goni, and said, I renounce my position as vice president. I'm not with the violence. It was a smart move in retrospect, because then he was named vice president. He had a certain degree of legitimacy. But a year and a half later, there was a second gas war, also in El Alto, similar around issues of exporting natural gas. And that led him to resign, Carlos Mesa, and led to Evo Morales' election. So long story short, El Alto, through FEJUVE, this Federation of Neighborhood Associations, there's about 600 neighborhood associations throughout the city, federated into this thing called FEJUVE. There's the Central Obrero Regional, or Regional Workers Central in El Alto, which is connected to the workers, the central union of workers in this country. That's also fairly strong there. There's lots and lots of other civic associations that exercise a lot of muscle in terms of protests. And so El Alto is just a very highly organized, highly mobilized city. But as I show, it didn't translate into participation. It translated into sort of gridlock and frustration and things like that. But that's where they got the rebel city from. Yeah, great question.
Sure. Be the last question. I don't. So thinking about this in terms of a transnational movement, municipalism didn't really reemerge sort of internationally until the end of your scholarship, right? But I'm curious about the relationship between the projects that you might have observed, Sucre and Torres, and that was Alto.
El Alto, Santa Cruz, yeah.
Yeah. And other projects in other cities. You mentioned the Workers' Party. So how, just how much are these activists tied to people in other cities and communities that are doing similar kinds of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the Workers' Party implemented this participatory budget in Porto Alegre starting in 1989, after winning an election in 1988, and then they spread throughout cities within Brazil, initially almost entirely Workers' Party cities, then mostly left cities. They also started to spread to Venezuela, to Argentina, so that La Causa Aire tried participatory budgeting in Caracas, not very successfully in the early 1990s. There was attempts in Montevideo, in Uruguay, many other places in Latin America. Eventually, more centrist parties and even some right-wing parties, conservative parties were trying to do it. Usually, there's not a lot of literature on it, but the minimal literature there is suggests those were usually failures and they were totally not participatory. So that, again, makes the Sucre case particularly interesting. The cases that I'm looking at, they didn't exactly emerge from that. What they emerged from was the 1999 Constitution, where Venezuela has this longer history of democracy in Latin America compared to other countries, where unlike Brazil and even Bolivia and Argentina and much of the Southern Cone, there wasn't a period of authoritarianism in the late 20th century. So from 1958 onwards, Venezuela was formally democratic and had a fairly functioning representative democracy through the 80s, and then it started to crumble and get corrupt and all sorts of economic and political problems. But because they never had this period of authoritarianism, a critique of representative democracy emerged, and there was a sort of push for a participatory democracy. So there's a longer history of that predating Chavez. Even some nominally right-wing parties actually had a left wing of them. So COPE, which is one of the more right-wing parties, are thought of as a more center-right party, had a very strong left wing in Torres and other places that did radical land reform and participation. And it's complicated and interesting. But then out of that, the 1999 Constitution emerged, and participatory and protagonistic democracy was like the central theme or one of the central themes of the Constitution. And then there was a series of laws to actually put that into practice. So it wasn't a municipalism, but it was actually a law of, it was a law of local, Consejos Locales de Planificación Popular, something, so CLPP, that happened throughout the country, and they didn't lead to participation in most of the instances, but there was a law to do participatory budgeting throughout. And they kind of based it off of Porto Alegre, and there was some building of that. After that happened, some places like Torres was one of the places that actually used that law to build a real participatory budget. After that happened, Torres became a model across the world. So Julio Chavez traveled to Chicago. He might have traveled to Madison, Wisconsin. I'm not sure. He traveled throughout the US. He traveled to other cities in Colombia and in Latin America, to Mexico, I believe. And even within Venezuela, he and his sort of key people in his team traveled around, and Torres was seen as a model for how to do successful participation. So there was this sort of, you know, they didn't think of it as municipalism exactly, but, you know, popular power, municipal power. Sucre also became an interesting model for the opposition after Carlos Ocariz, because he basically took over this Chavista municipality. I didn't get into the history, but Sucre was run by the Chavistas, Chavez's party from 2000 to 2008. And it was a shock that the opposition won in 2008. I mean, this was like the heart of Chavista territory. There's also billboards saying Territorio Chavista throughout Sucre, and it was like 80% popular classes, really seen as a bastion of Chavismo. And there was a lot of abstention between 2006 when Chavez won and 2008. I show in the book that, you know, there's like I think 39,000 fewer votes for Chavistas and almost exact same vote for the opposition. So it suggests a lot of absenteeism in the 2008 election, and that the opposition just won because of that. But then the opposition did actually increase its vote in subsequent elections. And then oppositionists elsewhere said, he's doing something interesting. He's doing something that's working politically. We should try this as well. And there was some, I don't know exactly how it worked, but, you know, there was the Sucre model was sort of spreading a little bit. And then the national conjuncture changed, and so it stopped a couple of years later, but there was a moment where it was sort of moved around a bit.
Thank you so much. And thank you for
All
coming.
right. Yeah. All right. Great. Yeah. No, thank you guys all so much for coming, and great to meet you. Again, if anyone does want to buy a book, you're welcome. All right.